Hello, everyone. You know who we are. Do I need to introduce ourselves? The two organizations that we chose for our presentation were Doctors Without Borders and the NCAA. So to get us started, we'll just do a quick introduction of both organizations, starting with Doctors Without Borders. The real name for Doctors Without Borders is Medicine Sans Frontier, or something like that, but it will be abbreviated to MSF for the purpose of just brevity in this presentation. So the stated purpose of the organization is to provide worldwide medical care to those less fortunate. They have a number of holistic kind of based beliefs. Mainly they're impartial, they're colorblind, meaning they don't pay attention to race or anything like that, and they are religiously and politically accepting. They have an associative structure as far as the organization of the company goes. So they've got kind of an upper and a lower tier for decision making. So they have 5 operational centers. They make the executive decisions, which is kind of larger picture stuff. So finances, overall policy when it comes to like donations, as well as maybe statements to the public or statements to governmental organizations, that sort of thing. And then they have 24 council offices for common policy. That's things like day-to-day decisions. So should we send an aid group to this area, or how many people should be in that aid group, or how much money should we provide to them, how will we fundraise that money, that sort of thing. In 2020, just to kind of give you an idea of the size and scope of the organization, they had a budget of $2 billion, but 90% of that budget came from private donors, which means it was not corporate, it was not government donations, it was private donors, individuals, not really organizations or investment banks, that sort of thing. So the NCAA, the National College Athlete Association, their purpose, the stated purpose, was to cultivate regulated competitive environments for students while also keeping them academically engaged. They believe in fairness, health, safety, welfare, and equal opportunity, of course. Their organization is a little bit different than MSF's. They have a board-elected president, subcommittees, and representatives from member schools. Their organization kind of mirrors what the U.S. government is, where they have an executive at top, and they have, kind of a representative democracy sort of going on, where the members' voices are supposed to be heard and kind of spoken for on the board when they make decisions. A little bit smaller size and funding. They had a budget of $750 to $1 billion on average. That's over the last couple of years. They make their money from member fees, ticket sales, television tournaments, and they do private donations as well. So some key differences just from what we know so far with the kind of definitions and just ideas of these organizations. So the NCAA was founded by the government, whereas MSF was founded on principles of governmental autonomy. The MSF wanted to be separate from the government, whereas the NCAA was literally put in place by a government. The NCAA was intended to protect and regulate, especially when it came to matters of student athletics, while MSF was intended to assist and recover. So it's proactive purpose versus reactive purpose. One serves to, set rules before things happen, and the other exists to, react to change, that sort of thing. The NCAA was really the first organization of its kind in the world, in the country and in the world. There had not been a regulatory body for, student athletes yet. So that being said, a lot of the policy that they came up with and a lot of the rules and everything like that was kind of groundbreaking. They had to start from scratch, right? Whereas MSF, they were created as a reaction due to dissatisfaction with the Red Cross. So they, like we talked about in the timeline, they came about because they didn't like what the Red Cross was doing. So when it came to coming up with policy and making decisions, they kind of had a structure to go on, even if it was the opposite of what someone else did. They still kind of had a foundation there. So that being said, the assumed leadership approach of MSF is member-led adaptive. That being, they are primarily adaptive leadership style, and they do place a lot of value on the power of the member. They are representative, they are dynamic, and they are neutral. They're representative in that most of the decisions are made by those smaller subcommittees. A lot of, again, the day-to-day, a lot of the actual doing in the organization is led by the people, the members, not by the organizational board. They're dynamic in that they are constantly changing and kind of, it's inherent in their style of leadership or their style of work that, we cannot, or they cannot have a rigid structure because these crises are are fluid, they're dynamic, and so in order to accommodate for that, the leadership style would have to be dynamic as well. And they are also neutral, which means there is no one agenda that they really push. So the voices of their members are always heard, they are always given equal weight, and that helps them stay neutral. I also intended that to mean that they are separate from any influence from outside influences. So, they're not swayed by government or politics or religion or anything like that. The NCAA, their assumed leadership approach was member influence transactional. So again, with member influence, they do place value on the voices of their members and their boards, or their member schools rather, but they do function in more of a transactional sense. They are still representative. They have that in common with MSF, in that the voices of the members are heard and the members have a say in some of the larger decisions. The task-oriented is where they kind of differ, because recently anyways, the NCAA has shifted into more being concerned with making money and fundraising, at least from an outside perspective. They host tournaments, they host fundraising, they sell tickets and everything, and that has turned them into more of a business rather than a leadership organization. And they are pretty hands-on. They are, by very nature, they establish these rules and regulations. And so that being said, they are very rigid with their leadership style because nothing can really deviate from the plan that has been set by the organizational board. And that makes them a little less adaptive than what MSF would be considered. So for some historical context on MSF, the story begins really in 1910, and it begins with someone totally not the MSF. It begins with the Red Cross. So the Red Cross was founded by Clara Barton. It was originally just an organization of nurses, very few doctors or surgeons, and they were funded by wealthy plutocrats and governmental bodies. So people like Carnegie and Rockefeller, people like that we've heard of, very wealthy, but also very politically minded people, very strong ties to the government. We fast forward half a century to 1967, and we're at the war in Nigeria. There's a civil war going on in Nigeria, and there are rebels who are rebelling against the government, and there are the government who America has sided with. So the rebels are mainly civilian, and the government has the military power in the situation. But there are, of course, casualties on both sides. And from America's POV, the rebels are the bad guys, so to speak. Bear in mind, those are civilians. They are armed civilians, but they are still the bad guys to America. So, there's a battle that happens outside of one of the major cities in Nigeria, and members of the Red Cross are dispatched to provide aid, so to speak, but they actually turn away the civilians in the situation, and they only provide aid to members of the government or people who were backing the government, and they completely ignore the rebels because they were the bad guys, right? And, Bernard Kouchner, who we're going to talk about next, he saw that, and he was very displeased with that because, if your organization says that it's there to help those who need it in times of crises, it doesn't matter who they side with, you should help them. And especially the civilians, not all of them were armed. Some were mothers and children and wives. So he did not like that. So in 1970, just a couple years later, Bernard Kouchner, he forms his own organization. It's got a crazy French name that we're not going to deal with. And another guy named Raymond Vorel, he forms his group as well. His group is founded to aid victims of a cyclone or hurricane in Nigeria as well. They're both French, and they kind of I like to imagine they literally just headbutted each other in the field. Both groups were going opposite directions, and they're like, hey, you're medical, we're medical, and then they kind of teamed up, right? So the year after, they merged their organizations and they found MSF. And MSF, again, stands on the ideas that we are not what the Red Cross was. The Red Cross was very limited and held down by these political and governmental affiliations, so we will not do what they did. And that is the history of the foundation. So for the NCAA, in 1906, kind of around the same time, college sports are really taken off in the U.S. There are a lot of student-athlete injuries, there's deaths, there's dropouts, and this leads to the formation of the IAAUS, which is the, I can't remember, so we'll just look at that before we present tomorrow, Alex. So anyways, in 1910, Theodore Roosevelt changes the name to the NCAA. It becomes a nationwide organization. The rules are outlined, but there's poor regulation, there's minimal leadership. It's more of just an idea. Basically, what Theodore Roosevelt was saying is, we need rules, and he put some in place, but there was not much power in the actual organization. It was kind of just a figurehead at that time. In 1951, another couple years later, right, there's the creation of the executive board. They elect this guy, Walter Byers, as the first president. All of a sudden, NCAA is picking up all these new responsibilities. They're regulating monetization, they're regulating publicity, they're regulating tournaments, they're hosting tournaments, hosting events, and that really leads to the NCAA taking off and becoming what we know it as today, which is more of a business, less of a regulatory body, and you can think of it as almost a business in today's terms. So some effects of these historical contexts for MSF, of course, naturally they place a high value on autonomy. They enforce donation limits, and they don't really accept governmental aid. They set very strict limits on how much money they take from certain sources. They do that because they want to avoid becoming what the Red Cross was. They don't want to feel like they owe anything to one certain government, or they don't want to have any political ties that might hold them back in the field, right? So kind of in a similar vein, they're implicitly neutral. They don't advocate military or political action. There is one exception during the Rwanda genocide. They did say, like, hey, it's really messed up over here. We need to get somebody's military in here to clean this up. And that's the only time they've ever encouraged military action. Again, that's similar to the value on autonomy. They really just want to stand for one thing only, which is helping those in need. They don't get involved with why those people are in need or who else could fix it. They just focus on fixing it themselves or providing aid. So their council is split between 29 countries, which provides a lot of representation from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds, and that keeps them, kind of neutral in its own. And then remember, influence leadership philosophy. The high offices, like we said, they make the operational decisions only. They try to stay away from the day-to-day because they know that as soon as you have boards and committees and all this kind of stuff regulating the day-to-day, you'll have the haves and have-nots, or the do's and do-nots, and they want to avoid that. They want to really focus on just providing help to those who need it. When it comes to some of the historical context of the NCAA, they of course are heavily influenced by the U.S. government. They were established by the government. They do have representation from member schools, but their organizational hierarchy is a lot like the U.S. government. There's an executive board, there's legislative boards, there's committees and subcommittees, and that kind of bogs them down in times. It's very difficult for them to make decisions because there is a long democratic process or quasi-democratic process that happens. So that being said, they are created for students. In their mission statement anyway, students are first and foremost. So rules, regulations, safety, and support, they've always had a place in the mission statement there. Recently, gender equality and inclusion have become subjects of focus just as the political climate has changed. And some could say it sets them apart from MSF, that they had to include those things in their focus because of political change, because they felt pressured to, because they have ties to the government and to large donors and that sort of thing. And that ties into monetary policy. They do take corporate sponsorships, so they might be subject to bias and lobbying, either good or bad. In the case of equality and inclusion, that would be a good thing that they would represent. But there could be a time where one of their corporate sponsors says, hey, we really promote this agenda, and if you don't, you're going to be out of, $20 million or whatever they say. And that happens in government. It can happen to the NCAA as well. Some contemporary context for MSF. So, recently we had this funny little pandemic that happened. The flu went around. So MSF, they spoke against the patenting or profiteering of COVID tests, modifications, vaccines, medications, and they had unity in this decision from all member countries. First and foremost, their focus was on care, patient care, providing for those in need. So of course they were heavily against anybody that might make money off of COVID or exploit those who need help during the crisis. And they were well praised for that. And Ukraine, which is a very recent and hot button topic, they were praised for their almost immediate response in Ukraine. They were in there actually like before hostilities even opened, before the shots were even fired or anything like that. They were already on the ground, and that really proved the efficacy of their loose organizational structure, their adaptive organizational structure, because they didn't have to worry about, well, does the board approve of this, or does the president of our company or of our organization say this or whatever. There were just some doctors in the area that were affiliated with MSF, and they said, hey, look, there might be some need for help in there. We're going to go ahead and preemptively get in there. And when things started popping off, they were ready to go. That's something you wouldn't see with the Red Cross. They would have to get approval from the federal government before any action could be taken, before anybody could even say anything. So it proves the efficacy of the adaptive style of business there. In the same vein, contemporary context, the NCAA, they recently had I say recently, but over the past decade, they've been doing a really big inclusion and diversity campaign, which is a good thing. They're bound by Title IX, so the organization is forbidden from anything related to sexual discrimination. They have to provide protection over that for their students. Their board of governors, they made the requirements ensuring protection based on sexual orientation and gender identity starting in 2016 as well, which was seen as a big step forwards. They also kind of in the vein of the LGBTQ community, there was some recent controversy around permitting transgender athletes to immediately participate in their events. Previously they would have to undergo a full year of therapy, and recently the rules in that changed, where basically you can sign up and whichever gender you identify with, you can compete in. So there were fights coming from both sides. They were criticized by some, they were praised by others. But this showed kind of an interesting flaw in that the only power that the organization has to enforce their rules is just to threaten to pull tournaments out of member states who they disagree with. They don't really have any other thing they can do, and this is a unique problem that they face. And you could tie that back to the transactional nature of their organization. They don't really have much say or sway other than pulling service and that sort of thing. So it is a unique weakness we see in their organization. So some final comparisons. Both organizations, they place values on the voices of their members. There's no denying that. We've got member school boards on the NCAA, and we've got those big national committees at MSF. The NCAA is often a little slower to act because they have a complex bureaucratic structure, whereas the MSF, they can act quicker because they are loose, they are adaptive, and the members have almost all of the power. MSF is not bound by political rules or ideas. They are free to do what they want when they want, because at the end of the day, all that they're doing is helping. Whereas the NCAA, they must often, have to consider opinions of everyone, from schools, from states, the government, their donors, corporate sponsors, that sort of thing, and that can often slow them down. So as a whole, this hopefully, and I'm just kind of making up stuff right now, I haven't really figured out a concluding statement yet, but as a whole, you can kind of see the difference between some of the pros and cons of transactional versus adaptive leadership. Transactional, they do get a lot done. They're very widely known. There's no arguing that they're successful. They've brought a lot of attention to student athletes, to schools. They've obviously made tons of money for everybody. But when it comes to actual social issues and political issues, they are a little weak. They're very slow to act, and they are bound by these external factors. Whereas in the case of MSF, they aren't a money-making company, and they are very quick to do what they need to do. But if it ever came to creating actual change, or in the case of like the Rwandan genocide, all they really have is their words to make change. They can't really, they don't have any power to throw around or anything like that. So it is a bit of a difference there, and that should conclude the presentation. All right, so I made all that up on the spot. I think a lot of it makes sense. There's a couple things we need to switch. And tomorrow when I talk to you, or just whenever you're reading this, when we talk, I'll just show you which slides I switch. But I think that's a general kind of rough idea of what we can talk about. That put us up at like 18, 19 minutes, which is great. She in class said she wanted like 15 at least, even though the document said 10, 15. So I think if we go about that pace, there's probably some stuff we can cut out. But I think that should be good for us. So cool.